At 3 in the morning, with the blue light of your phone still glowing on your thumb and the soft hiss of your room settling into silence, one number should bother you more than it does. About 300,000 years of Homo sapiens, and only about 5,000 years of writing. That means roughly 295,000 years of human life sit behind us like a dark hallway with almost every door shut. And it is the biggest missing chapter in the story of you. Because this is the part nobody says out loud often enough. You are told history in neat shelves. First this, then that. Villages, kings, scripts, walls, records. It feels solid. It feels complete. But the moment you pull back, the whole thing starts to look almost absurd. Anatomically modern humans have existed for around 300,000 years. People with hands like yours, eyes like yours, fear like yours, probably tenderness like yours. And yet written history covers only the last thin strip of that existence. The rest? Deep time swallowed it. If that doesn't make your skin go a little cold, it should. Because imagine opening a family album and finding only the last 2 pages still there. Birthdays, a few names, maybe one wedding photo. And everything before that, gone. You would not call that a complete story. You would call it a catastrophe of memory. So why do we accept it when it happens to our entire species? And here's where the ground gets even less stable. For a long time, people imagined the beginning of Homo sapiens much later than we now do. Then, Jebel Irhoud in Morocco forced the story backward. Fossils there, around 315,000 years old, pushed the origin of our species back by more than 100,000 years. Think about that for a second. The starting line itself moved. The first pages were not just missing, they had been filed in the wrong century of existence. That should make you very cautious whenever anyone talks about the human timeline as if it were settled and tidy. Now, maybe you could still comfort yourself with this thought. All right, the bodies were modern, but perhaps the minds were not yet. Perhaps these early people looked like us, but did not think in the rich, symbolic, unsettling way we do now. That would make the silence easier to explain. It would let you believe the long darkness was just waiting time. Except the evidence does not behave so politely. At Pinnacle Point, around 164,000 years ago, people were using red ochre. Not for bread, not for brick, not for bookkeeping. Red pigment. Color. Marking. Meaning. Something beyond the blunt mechanics of staying alive. And if that was not strange enough, Blombos Cave gives us more. Ochre there carries engraved geometric patterns from around 73,000 years ago. Pierced shell beads go back to around 100,000 years ago. Read that again in your mind slowly. Patterns and beads, tens of thousands of years before any city you have ever heard of. That is like finding a signature scratched into a wall in a house that official history says had no one living in it. Now the mystery sharpens. If anatomically modern humans were here, and if signs of symbolic thought were already flickering that far back, then what exactly happened in those 295,000 silent years? Why do the traces come like sparks in blackness instead of a steady flame? Why does the record show a species that seems recognizably human, and yet leaves behind so little that feels continuous? Anthropologists even have a name for this tension: the behavioral modernity debate. In plain language, it means this: when did human bodies become modern? And when did human behavior become fully, unmistakably modern? Were those two things separated by a vast delay? Or are we asking the wrong question entirely? Because if the body was ready, and the mind was already making symbols, then maybe the real enemy was never intelligence. Maybe it was disappearance. And in the next step, that is exactly where the trail starts to turn. If you enjoy these late night dives into the strangest corners of history, subscribe and stay with me. And that word, disappearance, is where the whole thing turns from strange to unsettling. Because once you stop imagining those early people as dull shadows waiting for history to begin, the silence becomes harder to excuse. Jebel Irhoud already tells you the body is ancient. Pinnacle Point hints that meaning is ancient too. Blombos Cave adds pattern, ornament, deliberate marks. So now you are left with a much more uncomfortable version of the question. They were already here. The traces suggest they were doing that very early as well. The real question is this: why does the record keep blinking instead of glowing? That is why anthropologists argue over something called the behavioral modernity debate. It sounds technical, almost harmless, but it hides a real wound in the story. Were anatomically modern humans already behaving in fully modern ways far earlier than the old picture allowed? Or did bodies like ours come first, while language, symbolism, social complexity, and shared meaning took a very long time to gather force? In other words, was the mind arriving in pieces, or are we only seeing pieces because almost everything else was swallowed by deep time? You can feel how slippery this becomes the moment you try to picture a real life. Imagine a hand rubbing red ochre into powder, fine dust in the air, a stain on the fingertips, a choice being made. Then imagine another hand, piercing a shell bead, threading it, wearing it against skin. There is no writing yet, no king list, no carved law, no temple account. But there is already selection, repetition, display, memory. Those things do not belong to a blank species. They belong to people who cared how something looked, what it meant, who saw it, and why it mattered. That is not a small step. That is a door cracked open in the dark. And still, the door never swings fully wide. That is the maddening part. The clues arrive like warm spots on cold stone. Here, pigment. There, geometry. Somewhere else, beads. Then, vast stretches where almost nothing speaks clearly. It is like hearing 3 notes of a song across a valley and being told the orchestra did not exist because you cannot hear the rest. Would you believe that? Or would you suspect the valley itself is swallowing the sound? This is where a lot of people quietly retreat to a comforting mistake. They think no writing must mean no real complexity. But writing is a very late kind of memory. It is only one way of storing thought. A mark on ochre is another kind. A bead worn again and again is another kind. A repeated pattern, recognized by more than one person, is another kind. None of these are books, but they are not emptiness either. They are signals from the edge of the visible. And you can feel the pressure building now, because the 295,000 silent years start to look less like a dead zone and more like a broken archive. Maybe that archive was always fragile. Maybe early, meaning lived in voices, bodies, gestures, pigments, objects that rot, habits passed from one person to another and then suddenly snapped. If so, then what we are staring at is not the absence of human richness. It may be the wreckage of it. A few surviving scratches, a few surviving beads, the way one charred page can prove a whole library once stood somewhere nearby. That possibility should make you sit a little straighter in the dark. Because if behavior was already gathering so far back, then the old story of a long, dull prelude followed by a sudden awakening begins to wobble. And once it wobbles, another suspicion creeps in. Maybe the problem was never that people were incapable. Maybe the problem was that whatever they built in memory could be broken faster than it could be preserved. And if that is true, then the next mystery is even more severe. What kind of human world can exist for thousands upon thousands of years and still leave behind almost nothing but a red stain and a hole in a shell? And once you start looking at it that way, the silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling damaged. You can almost feel the texture of the problem in your hands. A bead with a tiny pierced hole. Ochre dust caught in the skin lines of a finger. A carved pattern cut into a soft red surface at Blombos Cave around 73,000 years ago. These are not grand monuments. They do not roar. They whisper. But whispers matter when they come from so far back. Around 100,000 years ago, someone pierced shell beads there. Around 164,000 years ago, at Pinnacle Point, someone was already using red ochre. And much earlier still, Jebel Irhoud in Morocco pushed Homo sapiens back to around 315,000 years ago. So the pieces are scattered across a vast floor of deep time: body, symbol, mark, ornament. The trouble is, they do not line up into the clean ladder you were taught to expect. That is why the behavioral modernity paradox refuses to go away. It is not some fussy argument hidden in a seminar room. It is a real fracture in the story. If anatomically modern humans were already present that far back, and if signs of symbolic behavior appear long before cities, then you are forced into an uncomfortable middle ground. Either human thought became modern in a slow, uneven, almost flickering way, or it was there more often than we can prove, and the record simply failed to keep it. Those are very different possibilities, but both of them ruin the old bedtime version of prehistory, where everything stays dull and simple until civilization suddenly turns the lights on. And look at how strange that really is. A geometric engraving is not survival in the narrow sense. A pierced bead is not a sharper tooth or a faster leg. Red pigment is not meat. These things belong to a world of choice, display, memory, group identity, maybe grief, maybe status, maybe ritual. We do not get to know exactly which, and that uncertainty matters. But the fact that they point beyond raw necessity matters even more. It is like finding a theater ticket in the ruins of a house and realizing the people there were not only eating and sleeping, they were also imagining. So what are you supposed to do with a species that seems able to imagine, yet leaves behind so little continuous proof of its inner life? This is where people often make the mistake of demanding too much from the evidence and too little from themselves. You want a neat answer because your mind likes shelves. You want one first moment when humanity arrives, one date, one threshold, one clean before and after. But the traces we have do not behave that way. They come in flashes: a stain here, a pattern there, a bead pierced by a careful hand, and then a long, dark stretch where the ground says almost nothing. It may be because memory, before writing, was terribly fragile. And now the mystery becomes heavier, because if early meaning lived mostly in things that decay, skin paint, spoken teaching, gestures, stories, repeated acts, objects made from materials that vanish, then most of what made those lives human may have died exactly where it was lived. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was soft, perishable, mortal. Imagine trying to reconstruct your entire life from one button, one shopping receipt, and one fingerprint on a glass. Would anyone understand your fears, your loyalties, your private symbols, the jokes you repeat, the people you miss? Of course not. So, why do we assume the first people become simple just because their most human traces were the easiest to lose? And once you allow that thought into the room, another one follows right behind it. Maybe the great puzzle is not why those 295,000 silent years seem so barren. Maybe the real puzzle is how much had to vanish before they could look barren at all. And that is where your own instincts can start to mislead you. Because once you hear about early pigment, engraved ochre, and beads, the mind wants to rush ahead and declare the case solved. You want to say, all right, there it is. Humanity had already arrived. Mystery over. But the deeper you lean into those traces, the stranger the silence becomes. A few marks do not give you a full world. A pierced shell does not tell you whether its wearer lived in a stable tradition or in a fragile moment that flickered and vanished. The old image of prehistory being empty is too simple. But the comforting replacement, where everything was already fully in place, may also be too simple. And this is exactly why the argument refuses to die. The behavioral modernity debate sits right in that uncomfortable space, not between human and non-human, because Jebel Irhoud has already made that line feel older than many people expected, and not between mind and no mind, because Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave have already disturbed that easy division. The argument lives in a narrower, more haunting place. When do scattered signs become a whole way of being? When do color, pattern, and ornament turn from isolated clues into a dense human world? One with lasting memory, social rules, shared symbols, and meaning that survives from one generation to the next. You can hear how slippery that is. It is like finding a few musical notes scratched onto paper and asking whether you have discovered a song, a tradition, or only the remains of one. And deep time is merciless with that kind of question, because it may be that behavior did not arrive all at once. It may have come in pulses. A small group here trying something meaningful, another group there repeating a symbol, then distances, deaths, weather, movement, forgetting. Advances and losses, sparks and blackouts, not a glorious march forward. If that is true, then the 295,000 silent years were not silent in lived experience at all. They may have been full of speech, ritual, adornment, teaching, and social life that simply failed to harden into things we can still hold. That possibility changes the feeling of the whole story. You are no longer staring into a blank cave. You are standing in the ashes of many little fires, trying to guess how bright each one once burned. And there is another possibility, equally unsettling. Maybe the behavior was already richer than the surviving evidence suggests, but most of its containers were too soft to last. Skin paint disappears, fiber rots, wood returns to earth, gesture dies with the body, spoken memory leaves almost no fossil. If that was where much of human complexity lived, then of course the archive looks thin. Of course it does. You are asking stone and shell to testify about voices, customs, fears, loyalties, and private meanings. That is like trying to reconstruct an entire friendship from one dropped button and a smudge on a window. Would you trust that as the full truth? This is why the gap between modern anatomy and modern behavior feels less like a clean scientific puzzle and more like a wound in the record. We do not just lack information, we lack continuity. We have hints strong enough to destroy the old fairy tale, but not enough to restore the lost texture of those lives. And that missing texture matters, because once you accept that people may have been recognizably human far earlier than the old narrative liked to admit, one brutal question pushes forward. If they already had bodies like ours, and at least some of them were already using symbol, color, and deliberate pattern, then what kept all of that from accumulating into something that would leave a thicker trail? Or worse, what if it did accumulate again and again, and deep time kept erasing the evidence just fast enough for us to mistake erasure for absence? And that possibility changes the whole emotional weight of what you are hearing. Because now the mystery is no longer just, why is the record thin? It becomes, what does it take for a human act to stay alive after the human is gone? A hand can grind ochre at Pinnacle Point in 164,000 years ago. Another hand can pierce a shell bead around 100,000 years ago. Someone at Blombos Cave can cut geometric lines into ochre around 73,000 years ago. Those acts are real. They happened. They are not guesses anymore. But a real act is not the same thing as a lasting tradition. One person can make a mark. A group can repeat it. A generation can teach it. And then something slips. A break in memory. A move. A loss. Silence. That is where the gap becomes almost painful to think about. You are not dealing with a switch that flips from not human to human. You are dealing with a species that may have been arriving in layers of expression long before anything like written history. And if that is true, then the old demand for one dramatic beginning starts to feel childish. Real life is messier than that. A custom can exist without becoming permanent. A symbol can matter without surviving. A way of seeing the world can live intensely for a while and then vanish so completely that all you inherit is one stubborn object in the ground. It is like finding a single house key in the dirt and realizing there must once have been a door, and a room, and voices behind it. But the building itself is gone. This is why the behavioral modernity paradox keeps its grip on the story, because it points to the fracture honestly. The phrase is elegant. It isn't. Bodies that are recognizably ours appear early. Signs of symbolic thought appear far earlier than cities or scripts. Yet continuity, the thick braid of memory that lets culture stack and stack and stack, is harder to see. And that matters more than people realize. Intelligence alone does not preserve itself. Meaning alone does not preserve itself. If one person knows something and two others copy it, that is fragile. If a whole group carries it, teaches it, repeats it, protects it, then it starts to resist time. But when you look back into those 295,000 silent years, what you often see are not great walls of continuity. You see islands, and islands can drown. Maybe that is the wrong kind of comfort to lose, but lose it you should. We like to imagine that once something useful or beautiful appears, it naturally spreads and stays. That is a very modern fantasy. In the long, dark stretch before writing, every memory had to live somewhere vulnerable. In skin, in habit, in voice, in shared attention, in repeated gestures, in the willingness of one living person to show another living person what mattered. Remove enough of those links, and it does not matter how meaningful the original act was. It can vanish with shocking speed. A bead can outlive the meaning of the bead. A carved pattern can outlive the mind that knew why it was carved. What kind of tragedy is that? To leave behind proof that something mattered, but not enough proof to know what it meant. And if you let yourself really feel that, the tone of prehistory changes. It stops being a waiting room before civilization. It becomes a place of repeated beginnings, some of them bright, some brief, many broken. A trembling line. You can almost sense whole stretches of human life pressing just beyond reach. Shared colors, preferred shapes, ways of recognizing one another, rules nobody wrote down because everyone there already knew them. Then time closes over them, and all you get is one small surviving clue, sharp as a tooth. So here is the question that starts to bite harder than the others. If symbolic behavior appeared that early, and if anatomically modern humans were already present, then maybe the central mystery is not the appearance of the human mind at all. Maybe the central mystery is transmission. What lets one small spark survive long enough to become a fire? And what keeps that fire from going out in the dark? And transmission is where the mystery stops being abstract and starts feeling brutally physical. Because now you are no longer asking only what early people could think. You are asking how thought stayed alive. A bead can be made once by accident, perhaps. A pattern can be scratched once in a private moment. But a custom, a repeated symbol, a shared use of color, that takes more than one mind. It takes other eyes noticing, other hands copying, other bodies carrying the same habit forward. It takes time, trust, proximity, and enough stability for one person to show another what matters. In the long reach of deep time, that may have been the rarest thing of all: continuity. Picture it in the plainest way. A small group moves through wind, salt, dust, hunger, seasons. One older person knows how to prepare pigment. Another knows when to gather the shells that work best. A child watches. A younger adult copies the motion of the hand, the angle of the tool, the pressure needed to pierce without cracking. That is culture in its most fragile form. No shelf, no archive, no backup. Just living memory passing across a few bodies. And if one season goes wrong, if one group scatters, if one death comes at the wrong moment, the chain can snap. When that happens, the loss would be almost invisible to us now. We would not find a dramatic collapse. We would find nothing. Maybe one bead. Maybe a stain. That is why the old habit of calling these people primitive misses the point so badly. It assumes the missing trail reflects missing ability. But ability and accumulation are not the same thing. A person can be clever enough to invent something and still live in a world too unstable to preserve it. You know this from ordinary life. Think about how much disappears when one family member dies without passing on a recipe, a story, a name, a way of fixing a broken thing. Now, magnify that across thousands of generations, with no writing, no durable records, no permanent storehouse. It is like trying to keep a candle lit while walking through a field of shifting wind. If the flame keeps going out, do you blame the fire or the storm around it? And that storm may have been built into the human condition for most of those years. Small groups, wide distances, thin connections. Maybe the problem was not that meaning failed to appear, but that it kept appearing in places too scattered to reinforce one another. One cluster finds a useful or beautiful practice. Another does something similar far away. But without enough contact, without enough people, without enough repetition across enough lives, The pattern never thickens into something time can easily notice later. So the 295,000 silent years may hide countless beginnings that never became durable networks because they were lonely. That idea should unsettle you because it means the real threshold in human prehistory may not have been a magical leap in brain power at all. It may have been density. Enough people near enough to one another for memory to stop breaking so easily. Enough shared life for knowledge to survive bad seasons, lost elders, migration, fear. Enough overlap that one innovation did not die with the person who first carried it. That is a very different picture from the old story. It means the human mind may have been ready long before the human web was strong enough to hold what the mind produced. And if that is true, then those early traces from Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave become even more haunting, not less. They are not just signs of cleverness. They may be the surviving tips of whole social worlds that never reached critical mass. Worlds where meaning existed, spread a little, then thinned and vanished before it could harden into anything we would call history. So the next question is no longer whether early humans were capable. It is what kept their numbers, their links, and their memory so fragile for so long. And that question, what kept the fire so small, pushes you toward a possibility that is less romantic and much more severe. Maybe it was the crowd. You do not need to imagine stupidity to explain a thin trail through deep time. You only need to imagine very small groups spread far apart, carrying everything in living memory. A few people know how to prepare pigment. A few know when a shell is worth piercing. A few recognize a pattern and understand that it belongs to them. That may sound enough at first, until you remember what memory is like when it lives only in bodies. If one skilled person dies, a whole technique can weaken. If two families drift apart, a shared habit can split into fragments. If a child grows up during hunger, motion, and fear, learning becomes narrower. The world shrinks to what must be done now. That is not failure. That is pressure. And pressure can make even a brilliant species look silent from the outside. This is where the old picture of the first people becomes almost backwards. We are used to thinking that early humans lacked ideas, so progress was slow. But what if ideas were appearing often enough, and the real problem was that too few people were around to hold them steady? Think of it this way. One person invents something useful. Another sees it and copies it. A third improves it. Now you have the beginning of continuity. But if the group is tiny, one illness, one bad season, one dangerous move across unfamiliar ground can break the chain. Then the invention does not become tradition. It becomes a ghost. A faint trace that may never reach another valley, another shoreline, another generation. That is like trying to build a cathedral with 3 bricks at a time while the wind keeps carrying 2 of them away. How much beauty could begin under those conditions and still never leave more than a scratch in the earth? The behavioral modernity paradox feels sharper here, because it stops being a question of whether these people were ready. Ready for what? They may have been ready in the head long before the social web was thick enough to keep knowledge alive. A modern mind in a fragile network is still a fragile world. You can feel how cruel that is. The very qualities that make us human, teaching, copying, shared meaning, recognition, depend on enough repeated contact, over and over, across seasons, across births and deaths, across absences. If that web stays thin for long enough, then the 295,000 silent years start to look less like a mystery of empty minds and more like a tragedy of broken relay. And once you see that, even the smallest clues grow heavier. That pierced bead is no longer just decoration. It suggests at least one maker, maybe one wearer, maybe others who understood it. The ochre mark is no longer just color. It suggests choice, perhaps repetition, perhaps witness. The engraved pattern is no longer only a mark on a surface. It hints that someone expected form to matter beyond the instant of making it. But how many others saw the same thing? How many copied it? How many remembered it after the maker was gone? Those are the questions the ground almost never answers. It gives you the object and withholds the network. It gives you the ember and hides the hands that kept feeding it. So now the silence tightens in a new way. If early humanity stayed scattered, then maybe whole stretches of culture rose and fell below the threshold of permanence. Not because they were too simple, but because they were too vulnerable. Too few people, too much distance, too little redundancy. No backup memory except the next living person. And if that is true, then the next force you have to face is obvious, almost brutal in its simplicity. What happens to a species like that when the environment itself refuses to stay still? And that is when the backdrop itself becomes part of the crime scene. A fragile human web is one thing. A fragile human web inside an unstable world is something else entirely. If small groups were already carrying meaning in memory, pigment, ornament, and repeated practice, then they were doing it while living inside environments that did not owe them stability. Shorelines shifted, water sources changed, animal paths moved. Dry periods came, then relief, then stress again. You do not need a single dramatic disaster to thin the trail. You only need a species living close to the edge, where every change in land, season, or food can force movement. And movement is dangerous for memory, because memory likes return. It likes the same shelter, the same gathering place, the same people meeting again and again. But if your life is repeatedly pushed into motion, the whole structure of culture changes shape. What gets carried? What gets dropped? What is worth teaching when the next few days matter more than the next few years? Under that kind of pressure, even a meaningful custom may become a luxury. A symbol may survive in one place and vanish in another. A pattern may be remembered by one line of people and lost by the next. That does not mean the mind has dimmed. It means the world has interrupted the lesson. You can picture it without forcing anything strange into the story. A place near water is good for a while. People gather there more than once. They use color, maybe adornment, maybe some repeated act that marks belonging. Then the conditions shift. The place is less useful. The group moves. Another group does not return. A child learns less than an elder once knew. A habit survives only in fragments. The next time the ground preserves anything at all, you find one small clue and nothing around it thick enough to explain the life it came from. That is like trying to reconstruct a whole village from one spoon left in the mud. Would you call the village simple because the rest of it rotted away? This is where the silence starts to feel less mysterious in one sense and more haunting in another. The old version said nothing much happened for an immense stretch, then suddenly, history. But the more honest version may be harsher. Plenty may have happened. Plenty may have mattered. It just happened in worlds too mobile, too exposed, too breakable to leave a dense, continuous trail. The behavioral modernity paradox sharpens here. The issue may not be when people first became capable of symbol and shared meaning. The issue may be how rarely the conditions lined up for those things to accumulate without being scattered again. If you admit that, the surviving signs begin to look almost miraculous. That ochre from Pinnacle Point should not feel like a cute detail anymore. It should feel like a survivor. The engraved ochre and shell beads from Blombos Cave should not feel like isolated curiosities. They should feel like messages that made it through a storm no one wrote down. In a life shaped by unstable ground, each surviving trace is like a dry match pulled from wet earth. Tiny, easy to overlook, yet astonishing that it remained at all. If the archive is this thin even after conditions occasionally favored preservation, what vanished in all the places where conditions favored nothing? And there is an even crueler twist. The very landscapes that may have supported repeated human life best are often the ones least likely to hand their records back to you in one clean piece. Good places attract return. Return builds memory. Memory builds thicker culture. But if those places changed, flooded, eroded, or were simply reused too many times, then some of the richest human scenes of those early ages may now be the hardest to read. Which means the next place to look for the missing years may not be deeper in the cave. It may be where the land itself is gone. And once the missing ground enters the story, the whole archive starts to tilt under your feet. Because think about where people tend to return when life is hard. Near water, near food, near routes that can be learned, remembered, and found again. If the earliest traces of symbol already appear in places like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave, then you are not looking at mines cut off from landscape. You are looking at mines choosing places, revisiting places, investing places with repeated use. That matters. A place used once leaves one kind of trace. A place used again and again can become a knot in memory. And knots in memory are exactly what the long silence seems to be missing. So now the question grows teeth. What if some of the best places for early human life are also the worst places for us to recover intact now? Not because they were unimportant, but because the landscapes themselves changed. Edges of land shift. Shores do not stay obedient forever. Wet ground buries one layer and tears apart another. A camp by water can be ideal for living and terrible for lasting. That should make you very cautious whenever you hear the surviving record treated like a fair sample of the whole. Fair? It may be nothing of the sort. It may be the leftovers. That possibility changes the emotional tone of every earlier clue. The ochre at Pinnacle Point stops looking like an isolated oddity and starts feeling like something preserved by luck. The engraved pieces from Blombos Cave do the same. They may not represent rare moments of meaning, they may represent rare moments of survival in the record. There is a huge difference between those two things. One says symbolic life barely existed. The other says symbolic life may have existed much more widely, but the places where it unfolded most richly were not kind to future archaeologists. That is like judging a whole city by the few objects that happen to remain in a burned-out storage room. Would you trust that to tell you where people laughed, argued, taught their children, or marked belonging? And notice how this sharpens the pressure around the behavioral modernity paradox. If you only excavate places that happen to preserve stone, shell, or pigment under favorable conditions, then of course the story will look patchy. Of course it will seem to flicker. What you are really seeing may be a filter, not a full map, a severe filter, one that lets through a pierced bead, a scored lump of ochre, a few stubborn signs, while swallowing countless softer, richer, more ordinary acts of culture that took place in the wrong ground, in the wrong weather, at the wrong edge of the land. The puzzle may not be only about when modern behavior appeared. It may also be about where its strongest traces were allowed to survive. That is an almost cruel thought, because it means the emptiness may be partly an illusion created by preservation itself. The mystery is real, but the darkness may have been thickened by geography. The human story could have been fuller in exactly the places most likely to slip away from us. Camps where people met more often, places where ideas traveled farther, places where a symbol could become a shared habit because enough people crossed paths there. If those were repeatedly damaged, buried, or transformed, then the 295,000 silent years would look far quieter than they ever felt to the people living inside them. And if that is true, then the missing chapter is not just hidden in time. It may be hidden in bias, in the brutal fact that some materials survive, some places endure, and others take whole human worlds down with them. Which leads to a sharper, almost uncomfortable thought. Maybe we have been asking the wrong thing when we ask when people became fully human. Maybe the better question is this: what kinds of human behavior are easiest to lose first? And what does that do to the story we think the stones are telling? Once you ask that, the silence stops looking neutral. Because the first things to vanish are often the most human things. Not bone or shell or the lucky piece of ochre that happened to sit in the right place long enough. What goes first is the soft layer. Voice, gesture, repetition. The look between two people when they both understand what a mark means. The moment a child notices that this shell is worn differently, this color is used for a reason, this pattern belongs to us and not to them. Those are the fragile parts. They rot without leaving a shape. So when you look back at the behavioral modernity paradox, you have to be brutally fair. The record is biased toward what survives damage. That sounds obvious, but people still forget how extreme the bias is. Stone keeps its silence for a very long time. Shell can wait. Pigment can cling. But the richest parts of culture may never have wanted stone at all. They may have lived in skin painting, body movement, spoken memory, shared performance, repeated paths, habits around firelight, things made from materials too soft to last. If that is true, then the missing years are not only a gap in evidence, they are a gap created by the cruel preferences of preservation itself. And that changes how you should hear those early traces from Blombos Cave and Pinnacle Point. They are the notes that happened to survive after most of the instrument was destroyed, not the whole song. That is a very different emotional picture. It means you cannot automatically treat what survives as what mattered most. Sometimes what survives is just what could endure pressure. Imagine trying to understand your own life if all that remained were a button, a house key, and a coffee stain on one page. Would that tell anyone what you feared, what you treasured, what your family repeated, what your group believed about belonging? Of course not. So why do we keep asking the deep past to explain itself with only the toughest scraps left in its pockets? This is also why the old demand for a single, clean threshold begins to collapse. People want to know when behavior became modern, as if there were one morning when humanity woke up and suddenly recognized itself. But that question may already be warped by the archive. If the archive mostly keeps durable leftovers, then the emergence of symbolic life will always look later, thinner, and more abrupt than it may have felt to the people living it. The surviving evidence might not show the beginning of complexity. It might show the beginning of visibility. That is a huge difference. One is about when something came into existence. The other is about when the ground finally agreed to remember it. And you can feel the force of that distinction. A bead pierced around 100,000 years ago at Blombos Cave is not just an object, it is visibility. Engraved ochre around 73,000 years ago is visibility. The red pigment at Pinnacle Point around 164,000 years ago is visibility. Jebel Irhoud around 315,000 years ago gives visibility to the body. But what about everything that was fully real and still never crossed that brutal threshold? What about the meanings that stayed in breath, in custom, in repeated action, in private recognition? Those may have been everywhere, and yet to us, they are almost gone. The paradox grows sharper again. Maybe the human mind did not slowly awaken from emptiness. Maybe it was already rich in ways we can barely recover, while the archive kept forcing that richness to appear in broken flashes. Maybe what we call prehistory is not a long blank before history at all. Maybe it is history stripped of nearly all of its easiest to lose parts. And if that is the case, then the next thing you have to face is even more uncomfortable. If the ground only preserves fragments, and the best places for repeated human life may have changed or vanished, then how much of the story have we built from the wrong sample entirely? And if the sample is wrong, then the story built from it can be wrong in a very specific way. It can make living people look thinner than they were. That is the danger now, a false emotional picture, not just missing evidence. If you only recover the hardest leftovers from deep time, you start imagining early humans as hard creatures too, all edge, no interior. You picture survival and little else. But the traces we do have keep pushing against that. A red pigment used long before any city. Shell beads pierced with care. Geometric marks that did not have to exist at all. Those are not proofs of luxury in the modern sense. They are proofs of attention. And attention is never trivial. To spend effort on color, pattern, or adornment means something in the mind was already reaching beyond immediate hunger. That matters because it changes what the silence is hiding. It may not be hiding empty millennia. It may be hiding ordinary tenderness, preference, status, imitation, shared style, maybe even grief. All the subtle human things that rarely fossilize. You do not need to invent grand, vanished kingdoms to feel the force of that loss. A shell bead is enough. Somebody selected it. Somebody pierced it. Somebody wore it or carried it. Somebody else probably recognized what it meant, even if only in the smallest way. That is social life. That is a signal crossing from one person into another. Once you accept that, the 295,000 silent years become crowded in a way that most history books never let you feel. The behavioral modernity paradox sits right there, in that discomfort. It is not only about when certain abilities appeared, it is also about how badly our surviving evidence distorts scale. A few symbolic traces can look rare simply because everything around them died. The surviving record may shrink whole human worlds down to one object per 10,000 years. Think about how absurd that is. It is like trying to understand an entire neighborhood from one earring found in a drain. Would you say the people there had no conversations, no rivalries, no beauty standards, no rules, no inside jokes, just because none of those things survive in metal? Of course you wouldn't. Yet that is dangerously close to what we do to prehistory all the time. And the unfairness goes even deeper than that. What tends to survive is not just durable, it is selective. It favors certain moments, certain materials, certain places. A cave might hold on to something a shoreline would lose. A stain may remain where woven fiber disappears. A bit of shell may outlast the body that wore it by unimaginable spans. So even when you do get evidence, you're not getting an even cross-section of life. You are getting survival bias in physical form. The past is not handing you a balanced archive. It is handing you what the Earth failed to destroy. That should make you suspicious of every clean timeline, because clean timelines are usually built from messy remains. First this, then that, then modernity arrives. It sounds neat, but the actual traces do not line up like obedient steps. They flare, they go dim, they recur. Anatomically modern humans appear early. Symbolic hints appear far earlier than older stories were comfortable with. Then the record thins again. Not necessarily because people became less human, but because the conditions for leaving recoverable proof were brutal and uneven. It is like seeing a mountain range only when lightning flashes. You might mistake the landscape for separate peaks, when in truth, the ridges were always connected in darkness. So now another possibility enters the room, and it is a heavy one. Maybe the first truly modern thing was not a tool or a mark. Maybe it was the ability of one group to hold on to meaning long enough for the next group to inherit more than fragments. And if that is true, then the missing years are not only about invention. They are about whether memory itself could survive the handoff. Once memory becomes the real suspect, the whole case grows darker. Because a mark is one thing, a handoff is another. You can have a clever act without a lasting chain. You can have symbolism without inheritance. You can have a meaningful custom, even a powerful one, and still lose it if the next set of hands never receives it whole. That may be the most painful possibility in all of this. Their richest meanings may have died in transit. Think about what that means in plain human terms. One person knows why a shell is pierced. Another knows when red pigment is used and when it is not. A child watches, half understanding. An elder gestures, repeats, corrects, shows again. That is already culture. It does not need writing to become real. It only needs repetition and witness. But repetition is fragile when the group is small, when the land keeps shifting, when good places do not stay good, when distance keeps separating one pocket of people from another. Under those conditions, the human mind may be far ahead of the human chain that carries it. That is why the surviving traces feel so eerie. Jebel Irhoud gives you the body early. Pinnacle Point gives you pigment early. Blombos Cave gives you beads and geometric engraving early. Each one says, in its own hard little way, do not underestimate these people. And yet, none of those traces can tell you whether the meanings attached to them endured for 10 seasons, 100 generations, or one brief cluster of lives before thinning into nothing. It is like finding one surviving note from a melody and realizing the real mystery is not whether the song existed, but whether anyone was still singing it after the first singer was gone. And now you can feel the trap inside the behavioral modernity paradox. The question sounds like it is about the birth of modern behavior, but it may secretly be about the survival of modern behavior. That is a very different thing. Maybe the mind was capable much earlier than the thick archaeological trail suggests. Maybe symbolic life had already begun to pulse in scattered groups. But unless enough people held the same practices, unless they stayed connected long enough to reinforce them, unless the environment allowed return, rest, teaching, and repetition, those practices could remain brilliant and still remain temporary. That idea should unsettle you, because it means the silence may be full of failed continuities. Not failed because the people were lacking, failed because continuity is expensive. It costs time, contact, safety, attention, enough overlap between generations, enough shared ground that memory can become habit and habit can become identity. Without that, even a recognizably human world may keep collapsing back into fragments from our point of view. We find the fragment and mistake it for the whole. We find the bead and miss the social web. We find the engraving and miss the lesson that taught someone how to make it. We find the pigment and miss the eyes that knew what that color meant. That is like standing in a quiet room after a conversation has ended, seeing only one cup left on the table and pretending the silence proves no one was ever there. So the missing years may not be asking, when did humanity begin? They may be asking, when did enough humans stay connected long enough for their meanings to resist erasure? Once you phrase it that way, another pressure starts building. Because if continuity depends on numbers, contact, and repeated return, then the story is no longer only about minds or symbols. It becomes a story about whether human groups ever reached the density needed to stop forgetting so much of themselves. And once density enters the picture, the silence begins to feel less mysterious and more tragic. Because now you can imagine a world where meaning appears again and again, but almost never gets enough support to become durable. A small group may know a color matters. Another may understand a pattern. Another may pierce beads and recognize what wearing them says without saying it aloud. But if those groups stay thin, scattered, and vulnerable, then culture remains delicate in a way modern people almost never have to think about. It can exist, matter deeply, and still fail to accumulate, because the net holding it was weak. That possibility changes the emotional shape of the whole problem. The 295,000 silent years stop looking like a long delay before humanity became itself. They begin to look like countless partial victories against forgetting. A mark survives here. A bead survives there. A body at Jebel Irhoud tells you the human form was already present far earlier than the older picture allowed. But what if those surviving hints are only the tiny hardened ends of much larger human worlds? What if the real story is not emptiness, but repeated compression? Whole social lives squeezed down by time until all that remains is one object, one stain, one scored surface. You can feel how unfair that is. Imagine a whole lifetime reduced to one possession found centuries later. Someone in a distant future holds it up and tries to guess your world from that alone. Your loyalties, your fears, the things you teach children, the things you refuse to say in front of strangers, the way grief changes a room, the way belonging is signaled with almost invisible habits. Gone. And yet, that is very close to what we do with deep time. We take the few durable survivors and ask them to stand in for whole communities. No wonder the picture keeps looking thin. We are forcing fragments to do the work of memory. This is where the behavioral modernity paradox starts to sting in a different way. Maybe the problem was never simply when modern behavior appeared. Maybe the harder question is when modern behavior began to survive itself. Those are not the same thing. A meaningful practice can exist for generations and still disappear before the archaeological record grows thick enough for us to notice it as tradition. A symbolic act can be repeated many times and still vanish if the people carrying it are too few, too mobile, or too repeatedly broken apart. The difference between an invention and a lineage is not brilliance. It is continuity under pressure. And pressure, we already know, was everywhere. Thin populations, unstable places, soft materials, broken handoffs, harsh filters of preservation. Once you stack those things together, it becomes easier to understand why the record flickers. But it also becomes harder to keep telling yourself the old comforting story that early humans were just waiting around in mental darkness. No, the traces resist that. They keep resisting it. Red ochre at Pinnacle Point around 164,000 years ago. Pierced shell beads around 100,000 years ago. Engraved geometric ochre at Blombos Cave around 73,000 years ago. Those are not decorations glued onto emptiness. They are warnings that inner life was already there, and that the archive is almost certainly underreporting it. Now the silence has changed once again. It is not just the silence of missing documents. It is the silence left when too many human chains snapped before they could become thick enough to resist erasure. Once you accept that, another disturbing thought follows almost immediately. If so much could be lost, even when the mind was already capable, then maybe whole branches of human possibility rose and fell inside deep time without leaving enough behind for us to name them. And we may be descendants not of the first great continuity, but of one of the few that simply managed not to break. And that thought should humble you more than any ruin ever could. Because if we are here, partly because one line of continuity held while countless others may have frayed, then the old story of steady human ascent starts to look almost childish. We like ladders. We like clean progression. First bodies, then minds, then symbols, then culture, then history. But the evidence we have been following does not move like a ladder. It moves like scattered lights in fog. Jebel Irhoud tells you the human form reaches far back. Pinnacle Point tells you symbolic use of pigment reaches far back. Blombos Cave tells you patterned marks and beads reach far back. Yet, none of those traces guarantee an uninterrupted climb. They only prove that, again and again, something recognizably human broke through the dark. That means deep time may have been crowded with partial worlds. Real human arrangements of memory, status, belonging, and meaning that may have existed for long stretches and then thinned out, split apart, or simply failed to leave much behind. One group might sustain a symbolic habit for generations. Another might carry its own visual language. Another might recognize certain objects as social signals. But if those lines do not stay linked, if their numbers stay low, if their places keep changing, then the future gets almost nothing from them, except rare, hard fragments. That is like finding a single brick and realizing it came from a house, but never knowing how many rooms the house had, how many people slept there, or what names were spoken inside it. And now, the emotional center of the mystery shifts again. The question is no longer only what early humans could do, it is what kinds of human possibility vanished without building a thick archaeological shadow. That matters because it breaks the flattering assumption that we are simply the natural endpoint of all earlier attempts. Maybe we are not the peak of a straight line. Maybe we are one surviving branch among many branches that once held viable forms of human life, human memory, human culture. Not superior by destiny, just continuous by luck, by timing, by numbers, by conditions finally becoming favorable enough for knowledge to stack more reliably than it fell apart. If that feels unsettling, good. It should. Because once you stop picturing the past as a simple preface to us, the 295,000 silent years start to feel populated by forgotten alternatives, different rhythms of life, different ways of marking identity, different balances between mobility and return, different thresholds of social memory. Perhaps some of those worlds were brief. Perhaps some lasted far longer than we can now prove. But if they lived mostly in perishable things and vulnerable chains of teaching, then they could have been fully human and still become nearly invisible to us. That is the cruelty of the archive. It can erase richness without erasing existence. And that brings you back to the behavioral modernity paradox with an even sharper edge. Maybe what we call modern behavior did not emerge once. Maybe it emerged many times in many textures, some thin, some thick, some local, some sustained, some lost. The reason the record feels so frustrating may be that it is not showing a single ignition. It is showing repeated attempts at continuity under terrible conditions. Some caught, some did not. Some may have glowed for centuries in lived experience and still failed to leave more than a scatter of clues. If so, then asking for one clean beginning was always the wrong demand. The past is not obligated to give you a neat first chapter. It may only give you survivors. And survivors tell a dangerous kind of story. They tell you what remained, not what was common. They tell you what endured, not what was meaningful to most people most of the time. They tell you what the earth could not finish destroying. That is valuable, yes, but it is also a trap. Because if you mistake survival for importance, then you may keep reading the earliest humans as thinner, poorer, and more isolated than they truly were. So now another possibility steps out of the dark. What if the deepest missing chapter is not missing because nothing happened there, but because almost everything that mattered was made of living connections? And living connections are the first things time knows how to kill. And living connections are exactly the kind of thing the earth is worst at preserving. Stone can wait. Shell can wait. Pigment can cling to a surface for a shockingly long time if conditions are kind. But a glance, a lesson, a repeated gesture beside a fire, those vanish almost as soon as the bodies do. So the missing years feel so haunted. You are not just dealing with lost objects. You are dealing with lost relationships between objects, lost habits around them, lost ways of teaching them, lost reasons for caring. The material scraps that remain are like nails pulled from a burned house. Useful, yes. Real, yes. But they do not sing. And yet, even those mute scraps tell you more than the old story wanted to admit. They show anatomically modern humans were already present far back beyond the comfortable old timeline. They show color mattered early. They show a shell could be pierced for some purpose that was not simple nutrition or shelter. They show someone, somewhere, made deliberate marks that carried pattern. Once those signals appear, you cannot honestly put the human mind back in a cage of dull survival. That door has opened too far. The problem now is not proving humanity was there. The problem is facing how much of its lived texture may have disappeared before it ever reached us. This is why the silence can feel almost personal. If you imagine those people only as bodies moving through weather, the gap stays abstract. But the moment you imagine one person showing another how to hold a bead, how to prepare color, how to notice a mark and understand that it belongs to a shared world, the loss sharpens. Because now you are not missing data, you are missing inheritance. You are missing the soft machinery of culture itself. And that is a much more frightening absence. It means whole ways of being human may have lived, mattered, and vanished while leaving almost nothing that still answers back. The behavioral modernity paradox becomes even stranger here. Maybe modern behavior did not need to wait for some grand breakthrough at all. Maybe it kept appearing in local, fragile forms, then breaking apart before it could pile up into the dense historical layers we recognize more easily. If so, then what survived was not necessarily what mattered most. It was what happened to harden, what happened to lie in the right sediment, what happened not to be erased by movement, weather, or simple bad luck. That is like trying to understand a whole language from 3 words scratched onto a plate. You would know speech existed. You might even glimpse style, but you would still miss almost everything that made the language alive. And there is something deeply unnerving in that. Once you accept that the richest parts of early life were probably the easiest to lose, you stop seeing the long silence as a blank tunnel. It starts to feel crowded. Crowded with voices, signals, loyalties, taboos, preferences, recognitions. All the small, invisible threads that make a group more than a collection of bodies. None of that requires cities. None of it requires writing. None of it waits politely for history to begin. It only requires people capable of noticing more than survival. And we already know from those stubborn traces that such noticing was there. Now the real ache in the story comes into focus. The missing chapter may not be missing because early humans had too little inner life. It may be missing because inner life is one of the hardest things in the world to fossilize. And if that is true, then the next question is almost unbearable. If so much could vanish when memory lived mostly in bodies and repeated acts, what finally changed enough for those fragile human chains to begin holding more than they lost? And maybe that is the moment when the question finally turns. Not from, were they human enough, but from, what kind of world allows memory to thicken? Once you stop blaming the mind, you have to look at the conditions around the mind. You have to ask what changed between those early traces, the body at Jebel Irhoud, the red pigment at Pinnacle Point, the pierced shell beads and engraved ochre at Blombos Cave, and the much later world where memory begins to stack instead of scatter. Something shifted, more like enough fragile strands finally holding at once. That matters because people often treat writing as the birth of civilization, and, by extension, the birth of serious memory. But writing is only one form of storage, and a very late one. Before it, everything had to live in voice, gesture, routine, repetition, place, and shared attention. A mark on ochre is one kind of memory. A bead worn the same way again and again is another. A repeated action at the same spot over many seasons is another. None of those are empty. They are just terribly vulnerable. So the real threshold may not have been the first appearance of meaning, but the first time enough meanings could survive long enough to reinforce one another. You can feel the importance of that difference. If a symbol appears once, it matters to one moment. If it appears again, it begins to matter across time. If other people recognize it, repeat it, and attach themselves to it, then it stops being a private act and becomes part of a shared world. That is how culture thickens, through repetition that does not break. And in those 295,000 silent years, breaking may have been the rule. The surviving clues suggest that inner life was there. The real uncertainty is whether enough people could keep passing that life forward without too much leaking out of the chain. That is why the behavioral modernity paradox remains so slippery. It tempts you to imagine one decisive crossing from ancient to modern, but the evidence resists that story. It hints at minds already capable of symbol long before durable history. It hints at communities already doing more than surviving. Yet the trail remains thin, interrupted, jagged. So perhaps the paradox is not a single missing answer. Perhaps it is the record of many partial answers, many attempts at continuity, some brief, some stronger, most too fragile to build the kind of layered memory we recognize easily now. And that should make you rethink what late really means. If writing appears late, that does not mean mind appeared late. If cities appear late, that does not mean meaning appeared late. If the thick archive appears late, that does not mean the people before it were waiting in a dim hallway for history to invite them in. It may simply mean that stable accumulation is hard, much harder than we like to imagine. Hard enough that for most of human existence, knowledge may have lived brilliantly and died locally. Hard enough that whole traditions could be real, repeated, loved, and still vanish almost without residue. That is a brutal idea because it means disappearance may be normal and continuity the rare achievement. And once you say that out loud, the old timeline starts to feel upside down. We are used to treating the written record as the natural condition and the long unwritten past as the exception. But maybe the reverse is closer to the truth. Maybe fragility was the rule for almost all human life, and thick memory, memory that can outlast bodies, seasons, movement, and loss, was the extraordinary thing. If so, then the silence behind us is not evidence of emptiness. It is evidence of how hard it is for a species to keep itself from forgetting. And that leads to the next pressure point, the one that makes the whole mystery press against your ribs a little harder. If almost everything depended on living chains, and living chains break so easily, then what happens when those chains are tested not just by distance or loss, but by a true narrowing of the human world itself? And a narrowing of the human world is exactly the kind of pressure that turns memory from fragile into mortal. You do not need to picture some grand collapse with trumpets and fire to feel that. Sometimes, all it takes is fewer people, fewer meetings, fewer chances to repeat what matters. If the chain of teaching is already living from body to body, then a smaller human world is a more dangerous one. Fewer elders, fewer witnesses, fewer children learning the same thing in the same way. Fewer groups close enough to echo one another instead of drifting apart. Under that kind of pressure, meaning does not have to disappear all at once. It can thin. It can shrink. It can survive in outline while losing detail. It can become a habit no one fully remembers the reason for, and then vanish anyway. That possibility should make the surviving traces feel heavier again. The red pigment, the pierced beads, the geometric engraving, each of them may come from a moment when something held together long enough to leave a mark. But if the human world around those marks narrowed, then much more than objects would have been at risk. Nuance would be at risk. Shared recognition would be at risk. The exact way a thing was taught, the exact context in which it mattered, the exact difference between a private act and a group signal, all of that could become unstable very quickly. It is like keeping a song alive when fewer and fewer people know the tune. At first, they still hum it. Then they shorten it. Then one verse is gone. Then only the chorus remains. Then one day, someone remembers the rhythm, but not the meaning. And that is where the old question begins to look almost cruelly phrased. When did modern behavior appear? Maybe that is not wrong, but it may be too blunt for what really happened. Because appearance is only half the drama. Survival is the other half. A symbolic act can appear and still be swallowed. A shared practice can emerge and still fail to cross a narrow human bottleneck of attention, repetition, and group continuity. If that happened more than once, and the patchy record tempts you to suspect that it did, then the deep past was not a single dim corridor leading upward. It was more like a landscape of signals, some bright, some brief, many fading before they could join into something thicker. You can hear the ache in that, can't you? It means whole human possibilities may have lived right at the edge of permanence. Real ways of dressing, marking, teaching, choosing, gathering, remembering. Real inner worlds carried by anatomically modern humans who were already far more like you than the old stories wanted to admit. And yet, if the number of connected people stayed too low for too long, then even meaningful practices would struggle to outlast the lives holding them. One generation could inherit less than the last without even knowing what had been dropped. That is one of the saddest things in this whole mystery. Loss does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just arrives as a smaller inheritance. So the 295,000 silent years begin to feel less like a void and more like a field of interrupted transmissions. A signal starts. A few people share it. The line weakens. Another signal starts elsewhere. Different shape, same fragility. Some endure a little longer. Some leave one pierced shell, one scored surface, one stain of color. Most leave nothing you can hold. And because of that, the archive keeps handing you survivors without their chorus, relics without their full social breath. No wonder the past looks thinner than it probably was. You are listening to a damaged recording and mistaking the static for the original performance. Which means the next question is no longer just about how humans remembered. It is about what kind of change finally gave remembering a better chance than forgetting. And that question forces you to stop staring only at the artifacts and start staring at the system around them. Because remembering does not become stronger by magic. It becomes stronger when more minds can carry the same thing at once, when the same practice gets repeated in enough places by enough people for loss in one corner not to erase it everywhere. That is the real shift we have been circling. At some point, the fragile chain began to gain backup copies. Before that, one broken link could do terrible damage. You can feel it in the earlier traces. The ochre at Pinnacle Point tells you meaning was already being handled with human care far back in time. The beads and engraved patterns at Blombos Cave tell you attention, selection, and deliberate form were already alive. But those clues still come to you as isolated survivors. They do not yet feel like a world thick with redundancy. They feel like signals from small circles. Real circles, yes. Human circles, absolutely. But still circles vulnerable to thinning, dispersal, and loss. And if that was the normal condition for most of those long ages, then forgetting was not an accident. It was the default pressure. That should make you hear the silence differently, not as a dead blank, but as the sound left after too many local worlds failed to overlap enough. One group keeps a practice. Another, far away, develops something of its own. A third loses what the first two still know. Then seasons change, people move, children inherit only part of the pattern, and what survives into the ground is one small, hard clue stripped from the living web that once gave it meaning. It is like walking into an old house and finding a single spoon in a drawer. The spoon is real. The meal was real. The people were real. But the system that made the meal ordinary has vanished. And maybe that is what changed later. Not humanity itself, but the odds. If enough groups began crossing paths more often, if enough traditions began repeating in denser networks, then memory would stop behaving like a candle in separate rooms and start behaving more like fire passed across a village. One hearth goes out, another still burns. One elder dies, others remain. One place is abandoned, but the custom survives elsewhere. That is how culture becomes harder to kill. Because human connection stops being quite so easy to break. Now listen carefully to what that does to the behavioral modernity paradox. It makes the puzzle less about the first appearance of symbolic thought and more about the first durable spread of it. Those are not the same event. The mind may have arrived long before the network could protect what the mind produced. That would explain why the evidence feels both early and thin at the same time. Early enough to ruin the old simple story, thin enough to keep the mystery alive. And there is something almost chilling in that possibility. It means the 295,000 silent years may not be asking you to locate a missing invention. They may be asking you to understand a missing threshold of resilience. A point where memory stopped depending so completely on one body, one group, one place, one season. A point where loss was still painful, but no longer total every time a line snapped. If that is true, then the long, unwritten past was a test of intelligence. Whether intelligence could build enough overlap to outlast its own fragility. And once you frame it that way, one last unsettling thought starts moving in the dark. What if our own world, for all its noise and storage and endless recording, is not nearly as safe from that same kind of forgetting as we like to believe? And that may be the most dangerous illusion of all, that storage means safety. You know the feeling. A photo goes into your phone, a note into a cloud folder, a message into a thread that seems like it will exist forever. Your age feels overprotected by memory. Compared with those early people, you seem armored. They had bodies, voices, repeated acts, pigment on skin, beads on a cord. You have servers, backups, copies, endless duplication. So it is tempting to look back at those long missing ages and feel a little superior, as if their problem was fragility and ours is permanence. But permanence is a story modern people tell themselves when the lights are still on. The deeper truth is uglier. Memory has always depended on systems outside itself. For the earliest humans, that system was living people meeting living people often enough to keep meaning intact. For you, it is power, hardware, software, compatibility, stable institutions, and a chain of technical habits most people barely understand. Different tools, same dependence. If the chain breaks, the archive can thin shockingly fast. That should make the past feel less remote, not more. Because the old wound in human history was never just "we forgot." It was the structure carrying memory failed. And any era that believes it has escaped that rule should probably lower its voice. Now go back for a moment to those oldest surviving signals. Jebel Irhoud tells you the human form was already present very far back. Pinnacle Point tells you symbolic attention was present far back. Blombos Cave tells you pattern and personal adornment were present far back. So the missing years are not the story of empty-minded creatures waking up late. They are the story of minds repeatedly brushing against meaning while struggling to keep that meaning from being erased. Once you understand that, the gap behind us stops feeling primitive and starts feeling familiar. Because what are we really talking about here? Not just tools, not just dates, not just whether a bead counts as symbolism or a carved mark counts as abstract thought. We are talking about continuity under pressure. We are talking about whether a species can carry itself across spans of instability without shedding too much of what makes it itself. The behavioral modernity paradox sounds technical, but under the skin, it is almost intimate. It asks whether human inwardness can survive the world outside it, whether one generation can hand the next more than fragments, whether meaning can remain thick enough to resist time. And that is why the old record matters so much now. Those early traces are small, yes, but small things can expose huge truths. A stain of red pigment says the mind was already reaching beyond raw necessity. A pierced shell says identity or signal or beauty had already entered the scene. A geometric engraving says form mattered enough to be repeated by hand. These are not loud artifacts. They do not shout. Yet together, they accuse us. They accuse every easy timeline, every smug account of progress, every cartoon of early humanity, as if real people spent most of their existence waiting to become us. No, they were already themselves. The tragedy is that most of their continuity did not survive in forms we can easily read. And when you let that sink in, your own era starts to look thinner than it boasts. Because your civilization records everything, but understands permanence less than it thinks. You produce oceans of memory in formats that can die from neglect, failure, or simple obsolescence. You trust systems you did not build and cannot repair alone. You scatter your continuity across machines, networks, and institutions that feel solid until the day they don't. So when you look back into those silent ages, maybe you are looking at the oldest human weakness of all: the need to believe that what matters will keep itself. It never does. And if that is true, then the real warning hidden inside the 295,000 missing years is not only about them. It is about how easily a species can mistake active memory for guaranteed memory right before the chain gives way. And that is where the mystery stops pointing only backward and starts pointing straight at you. Because if the oldest human problem was never lack of thought, but the fragility of the systems carrying thought, then your own age is not standing outside that danger at all. It only wears a different costume. The early chain lived in bodies, repeated acts, and a few durable traces like pigment, shell, and engraved marks. Your chain lives in power grids, drives, servers, passwords, formats, signals, and institutions that feel solid mostly because they are still functioning tonight. The shape has changed. The weakness has not. That should make the long silence feel much less remote. Look at what those early clues already forced us to admit. Jebel Irhoud pushed the human form far back. Pinnacle Point pushed symbolic use far back. Blombos Cave pushed patterned marking and adornment far back. So the old image of a species wandering through emptiness for almost all of its existence is already broken. What remains unresolved is not whether those people had minds rich enough for culture. It is whether their worlds could hold that culture long enough, widely enough, and securely enough to keep it from thinning into fragments. Once you see that, you start noticing the same pressure in your own world. We record everything, yes, but we also trust systems so complex and layered that most of us could not rebuild even one of them from scratch. And that matters more than people like to admit. Because memory is not just storage. It is recoverability. It is continuity. It is the ability of one generation not merely to leave traces, but to leave traces the next generation can still read, still access, still place inside a living chain of meaning. A photo no one can open is not much better than a story no one remembers. A file trapped in dead hardware is not so different, emotionally, from a symbolic practice buried in a vanished group. The surface changes. The wound does not. It is like writing your whole family history on glass, and then acting surprised when one dropped box turns years into dust. Why should the future be kinder to our assumptions than deep time was to theirs? So the 295,000 silent years carry such a sharp warning. They show that disappearance does not need stupidity. It does not need laziness. It does not need a lack of beauty, curiosity, or intelligence. It only needs broken transmission. A few snapped links. A few lost supports. A little too much dependence on systems that look permanent from the inside. The early people had that problem in one form, we have it in another. The gap behind us is not proof that they failed to become fully human. It may be proof that being fully human has always included the terrifying possibility of forgetting ourselves faster than we expect. And the behavioral modernity paradox looks different under that light too. Maybe it was never just a question about when the mind became modern. Maybe it was always partly a question about when memory became resilient enough to leave a thicker stain on the world. The body arrives early. Symbolic hints arrive early. Yet the lasting archive stays thin for an immense span. That should not only make you curious, it should make you nervous. Because a species can be inwardly rich and outwardly fragile at the same time. It means whole eras of real life can shrink almost to nothing if their transmission systems fail. So when you hold those earliest traces in your imagination, the red dust, the shell with its tiny hole, the engraved lines pressed into ochre, do not picture them as relics of a lesser humanity. Picture them as warnings from people who were already close enough to us to be recognizable, yet still vulnerable enough to leave almost no lasting chorus behind them. And if that is true, then the final question before the end of this journey is the one most people try hardest not to ask. When future eyes look back at us, will they see a civilization that finally solved the problem of memory? Or just another brief flare that mistook abundance for permanence? And if the answer is the second one, then our pride is built on very thin ice. Because a brief flare is still a flare. It can light the night, impress everyone standing inside it, and still leave almost nothing behind once the fuel is gone. That is the part modern people hate hearing. We think volume equals durability. We think more records means safer memory. We think endless copying means permanent continuity. But the old human story keeps whispering the same warning through every hard little survivor. A stain of pigment, a pierced shell, a carved pattern, a body in stone. What matters is not how much is produced. What matters is what can still be carried when the system around it weakens. That is why the long missing stretch behind us should not be treated like a curiosity for museums and late-night documentaries. It is a mirror, a brutal one. Those early people may already have had minds capable of symbol, care, attention, identity, and repeated meaning. We know that much now. Jebel Irhoud pushed the human form back. Pinnacle Point pushed symbolic use back. Blombos Cave pushed deliberate pattern and adornment back. So the old fantasy of a near-empty species waiting forever to become itself has collapsed. What remains standing is something much more uncomfortable. A species can be fully human and still fail to preserve most of itself. Now let that settle for a moment. A species can be inwardly rich and archaeologically poor. It can hold beauty, rule, status, attachment, preference, and ritual in living chains, and still appear almost blank later if those chains break often enough. That is not only their danger, it is ours too. Your civilization stores oceans of information, but so much of it lives inside systems so fragile, layered, and dependent that a future break would not need to erase everything evenly. It would only need to erase enough connections that the remainder stops making full sense. That is how forgetting really works, sometimes as surviving fragments that no longer know how to rejoin. And that is why the behavioral modernity paradox has such an eerie aftertaste. The puzzle was never only about when thought became modern. It was also about when human worlds became durable enough to leave thicker evidence of themselves. Once you understand that, the past behind writing no longer feels primitive. It feels precarious, full of real human lives balanced on unstable bridges of transmission. Some crossed, some fell. Some made it just far enough to leave one hard clue in the ground, then vanished from the chorus forever. You can almost feel the tenderness of that loss. Someone chose that red color. Someone threaded that shell. Someone cut those lines. Someone saw those acts and understood them, at least for a while. There were eyes on them and memory around them and probably feelings attached to them that no sediment will ever return. Those people are not abstractions anymore. They are close enough to you now to hurt. And that closeness is the real climax of the mystery. Just this quiet, devastating recognition. The distance between you and them is much smaller than the gap in the record makes it seem. So when you think about those 295,000 silent years, do not imagine a dead hallway before history switched on the lights. Imagine rooms full of human life, one after another. Most of them lost because the walls were made of breath, memory, and contact. And if that image stays with you tonight, then one final step remains. If the deepest human problem has always been how to keep meaning alive across unstable time, what exactly are we leaving for the next hands that reach back for us? And that is the question that should stay with you longer than any single artifact ever could. We have already crossed that bridge. Symbolism appeared before writing. Anatomically modern humans were already here astonishingly far back. The deeper question is whether any civilization, including your own, ever truly escapes the old human bargain: create meaning faster than time can strip it down. Because that bargain is ruthless. The first people we have been following through this darkness left almost no written trace, yet they still managed to send signals through immense spans. Jebel Irhoud tells you the body was already there. Pinnacle Point tells you color was already doing more than survival work. Blombos Cave tells you pattern and adornment were already being made with intent. Those are not huge archives, they are tiny survivals. But tiny survivals can expose a giant truth. Human richness does not guarantee human permanence. It never has. And once you admit that, the comfort of your own era starts to sound a little hollow. You live in a world of constant recording, yes. Every message, photo, search, note, and location seems to promise immortality through duplication. But duplication is not the same as durability. 1,000,000 copies inside fragile systems are still fragile. If the chain that keeps them legible breaks, then abundance can collapse into opacity very fast. Future eyes may find traces of us everywhere and still fail to understand what mattered, what was repeated, what was sacred, what was ordinary, what was only noise. That is the same old wound wearing a newer mask. The medium changes. The danger does not. Now think again about those long missing ages, not as an empty tunnel, but as a warning written in absence. What vanished there may not have been less meaningful than what survived. It may simply have been softer, more dependent on bodies, on repeated presence, on stable handoffs, on enough overlap between one life and the next. The behavioral modernity paradox stops feeling like a technical debate once you grasp that. It becomes painfully human. It asks whether our species can ever hold on to its own interior life securely enough to outlast disruption. The answer, so far, is mixed. Sometimes yes, often no. And the silence behind us is the proof. That is why humility matters here more than certainty. It is easy to mock the deep past because its record is thin. Harder to admit that thin records can hide thick lives. Harder still to admit that we may be producing our own future thinness right now, in a different form. The people behind the ochre, the beads, the marks, they are not a prologue to us. They are fellow humans caught in the same ancient struggle. How do you keep meaning from dissolving when the systems carrying it are fragile? Once that question becomes clear, the distance between their world and yours shrinks to something almost uncomfortable. You can feel it, can't you? The same species, the same basic hunger to mark, to remember, to pass something on. The same risk that what matters most may not survive in the forms that endure best. the same temptation to mistake active memory for safe memory. That is the true force of the 295,000 silent years. They do not only tell you that the archive is incomplete, they tell you incompleteness may be the normal human condition, unless enormous effort keeps pushing against it. And now, only one final move remains. If the oldest chapter of our story is a warning about how easily continuity breaks, then the end of this journey cannot be about the past alone. It has to be about what kind of ancestors we are choosing to become. And the answer to that is not abstract at all. It is embarrassingly practical. What kind of ancestors are we becoming? The kind who assume memory will look after itself, or the kind who understand that continuity is work. That is the real pressure hidden inside this whole journey. Those early humans did not fail because they lacked minds. The traces from Jebel Irhoud, Pinnacle Point, and Blombos Cave already shattered that old insult. They failed, if that is even the right word, because minds alone are not enough. Meaning needs carriers. It needs repetition, overlap, durability, and systems that survive stress. Without those, even a rich human world can thin down to a stain, a bead, a few lines cut into ochre, and then almost nothing. That should make your own time sound a little less triumphant. You live surrounded by records, but not necessarily by wisdom about records. Your age preserves everything and preserves almost nothing. It captures oceans of detail while trusting delicate chains of electricity, hardware, standards, institutions, and habits of upkeep that most people never think about until something breaks. And when something breaks, the loss is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. A missing password, a dead format, a server abandoned, a context forgotten. 1,000 files survive, but the map that made them meaningful disappears. That is not so far from the old human wound we have been tracing through deep time. A symbol survives. The key to it does not. And now the old clues begin to press on you in a new way. Red pigment at Pinnacle Point is not just old, it is disciplined. Pierced shell beads in Blombos Cave are not just decorative, they are relational. The engraved patterns are not just clever marks, they are proof that someone expected form to matter beyond the moment of making it. Those traces are tiny acts of defiance against oblivion. Small, yes, but still defiance. They show that even in those staggeringly early ages, people were already trying to push something of themselves across time, across other minds, across absence. That instinct is not new. It is one of the oldest things about us, which means our responsibility is older than we usually admit. The 295,000 silent years are not only a mystery to solve, they are a standard to measure ourselves against. If we know now that so much of human life can vanish when transmission systems fail, then we lose the excuse of innocence. We cannot say we were never warned. The warning is already built into the past. It is built into every thin trace that survived while most of its world did not. It is built into the behavioral modernity paradox itself, because that paradox keeps whispering the same unbearable lesson. A species can be fully human long before it becomes reliably memorable. And that is where the story turns from fascination into duty. Curiosity is not enough anymore. Awe is not enough. Even discovery is not enough by itself. If you really understand what these missing ages are telling you, then you begin to care not only about what was lost, but about what can still be carried. What deserves redundancy? What deserves translation into forms that outlast convenience? What deserves to be held in bodies as well as machines, in shared memory as well as storage, in practices as well as archives? Otherwise, we are doing what fragile civilizations always do, mistaking access for inheritance. So when you think of those early humans now, do not picture them as dim figures behind fogged glass. Picture them as your warning ancestors. They reached out through stone, shell, and pigment because that was what they had. We reach out through code, glass, and electricity because that is what we have. Different materials, same wager. The wager that something meaningful can cross the gap. The wager that the next hands will still know how to read what the last hands meant. And in the final step of this journey, that is the question we have to face without hiding behind wonder anymore. When the chain finally reaches us, what exactly are we passing on? Memory or just debris? And that, in the end, is the true shape of the mystery. No hidden empire, miracle machine, or childish fantasy dropped into the dark to spare us the harder truth. The harder truth is more unsettling because it is so human. Anatomically modern humans were already here. Jebel Irhoud pushed that reality far back. Pinnacle Point showed that color already carried meaning long before any city. Blombos Cave showed that pattern and adornment were already alive in the hands of people who would never write their names. The long silence was never proof of emptiness. It was proof of how much can be real, shared, loved, and still disappear when continuity fails. That is the resolution, if there is one. The 295,000 missing years of human prehistory are not a blank corridor waiting for one grand answer. They are a shattered mosaic. Some pieces stayed in the earth, most did not. What survived is enough to break the old arrogant story, but not enough to give us back every face, every signal, every rule, every grief, every act of recognition. And maybe that is exactly the lesson. The species did not spend almost all of its life asleep and then suddenly wake up. It kept waking and losing and carrying and dropping and trying again, under pressures most of us never have to feel in our bones. That should change the way you see those earliest traces forever. The red pigment isn't a cute footnote anymore. The shell bead isn't a museum curiosity anymore. The engraved lines aren't a puzzle piece in some tidy academic debate anymore. They are survivors. They are what remained after weather, movement, death, forgetting, and deep time finished taking almost everything softer than stone. They are the last dry threads on a torn cloth. When you picture them that way, something shifts. You stop asking why the past left so little, and you start asking how anything at all made it through. And there is the wisdom hiding in plain sight. A tiny hole in a shell can outlive the hand that drilled it by longer than empires last. A smear of red can outlast the voice that explained it. The smallest thing becomes enormous the moment it is the only thing the flood does not take. That is what those vanished ages leave in your palm tonight. Something stranger, and maybe more valuable. Humility, not certainty or closure. A sense that the human story is much older, much more fragile, and much more crowded with invisible lives than the neat shelves of recorded history ever taught you. You are not standing at the end of a straight road. You are standing on one surviving patch of ground in a landscape where most footsteps washed away. So when you set your phone down after this, and the room goes quiet again, remember how thin the line really is between memory and loss. We inherit more than facts from the deep past. We inherit an unfinished task. The screen darkens. The glass cools in your hand. Somewhere behind all the noise of the present, a bead, a stain, and a handful of carved lines are still holding their ground in the earth. If this journey stayed with you, subscribe and come back for the next one. And if one image from tonight won't leave your mind, leave a comment. I'd like to know which fragment crossed the gap with you.